Welcome to the Tradeswomen Australia Online Summit. This week we're talking about leadership during a crisis, and before I begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here tonight. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining us here this evening. This week's topic is something that I'm really excited about, and we have two brilliant guests to share their knowledge. And those guests are Suzi Finkelstein, the CEO of Women in Leadership Australia, and Dr. Terrance Fitzsimmons, who is the Senior Lecturer in Leadership Theory for the University of Queensland and also the Managing Director of the Australian Gender Equality Council. So please welcome our guests and welcome our host, Andrew Gill, who is joining myself, Fiona Mcdonald, the Tradeswomen Australia Managing Director. I appreciate you all joining us here tonight and celebrating with us what Tradeswomen Australia does best, engages with our community, and also works towards continuing to increase the number of women in trades and keeping them there. So thanks again for joining. We will now cross over into the industry panel where we are about to turn to our audience and ask them some questions to bring forward to our guests. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Thanks again for joining us. I'll go to a question. Alison's posted a question. What is the one piece of advice that you have both received that really changed how you lead? And perhaps if you could share with us who that advice came from as well.
Suzi's going first. I saw that, just thinking cogs going.
Well, mine, I think, look, stepping into a CEO space, I've had some very generous other CEOs come in and say, you know, let me walk beside you because I know what this transition's like. And particularly the CEO of Maddox, which is a very big law firm, Michelle Dixon, and her advice to me was really interesting, and it was exactly what Terry was saying, actually. It's about the over-communication, that there isn't any, that there's no such thing as over-communicating at this point. And her leadership advice was about don't feel like you have to fill up the gaps with answers, and to be asking questions, and exactly that, saying, I don't know, but stepping back so that they know that they've been heard. And I think in this time as well, that we really need to ensure that there's that connectivity. And going back to Andrew's point before, you know, when we're only having this Zoom connection, it's really critical. You know, mental health is the biggest concern that I have across our workforce, and really understanding what it looks like for some people who don't like to put their camera on, calling people, having the conversation, recording video communications so that we're actually seeing each other. There's been some great research about, in the beginning of a conversation on Zoom, if people are all, like Terry was saying, they don't have their camera on, you actually feel less psychologically safe to talk and you feel more disconnected. And I think that connection space that Michelle was talking to me about has been, I mean, it is specifically now, but I think it's a really important leadership characteristic as well.
Terry?
I think the best advice that I got was when I started out. And so it's a while ago now. It was Dr. Neil Flanagan who wrote that 1 Minute Manager. And he said that, you know, we shouldn't be afraid to seek feedback. That is, so if we don't know, if we don't ask people about ourselves, we're blind to things that other people are not blind about. So if we've got fundamental flaws or failings and we don't ask, we will never know, in which means we'll never be a good leader. And the other thing is there's this idea that we shouldn't share, particularly our values and particularly the deeper things, you know, not just the surface technical things, but you know, there's this old, I guess more in the 90s, this idea that we need to be solo operators. And I think the idea is, well, no, if you don't share yourself as a human being, others won't see you that way. And they won't know how to respond to you either and give you the information you need in a time of crisis. So that openness, I think, as a leader is critical, not shutting down, not trying to be the perfect leader, but, you know, well, of course, trying to be the perfect leader, but not, you know, doing it solo and not closing yourself down. And that's great advice. And it's hard. And it's interesting that authentic leadership actually is the theory around that. But the idea that you need to know yourself, and the only way you can know yourself is by others knowing you. So I think that was probably the best advice I ever got.
Great advice, Terry, too. What I love, too, that you talked about, Suzi, was you are someone who teaches and coaches and communicates all about leadership, but you are still open to receiving leadership advice, which, of course, you should be, but just to hear that is very, very good. If you look out there into Zoom land, there are lots of people with their phones on tonight. We've got lovely Jenny's there, and Linda's iPad. She's reclining back, looking relaxed, and Tez. All good people. I can't see underneath all these things. We've got Laura there, so lots of good people. So thank you for there. Debbie, there's Debbie. Debbie's online. Good to see Debbie. Fantastic. So that is a really interesting insight too, Suzi. You talked about making sure that you keep this open and not shut, because we would think we're private. I've lost my train of thought. We're going to go on to this because, Fiona, let's go to our first video question, if we could, Andrew.
Hi, my name is Kirsty O'Connor. I'm a construction manager at Simmons Homes. My question is, what are the most important qualities of a leader, and what can I do to encourage more women into leadership in a very male-dominated industry?
Now, Kirsty, thank you very much. We actually touched on Kirsty 2 weeks ago because she works for the Simmons Group, and she started off in trade, and she was, I think, a salesperson and wanted to get into construction management, which she's doing now very, very well. Can you give us a sense? We've probably answered the first part of the question, but how do we go forward and actually, get more leadership into this particular sector? Because this is a specific area that obviously Fiona is very passionate about. Suzi?
Yeah, I think, look, we work with lots of sectors where it's very male-dominated, and the challenge is when you're the non-dominant group, you're one of those people that stand out and don't look like everybody else, it's very hard to be noticed. And I think some of the other challenges, particularly we see from our participants, when women are working really hard to get to the position that they've got to, they can be pigeonholed, and it's hard for them to take a step up or a step out, because the view is that they're too busy, that they don't want to step up, they've got so much on their plate. So I think one of the answers is actually to create that awareness and to be able to step up and say what you want. We also need, I like this concept about amplification. We need other people to amplify what we do. I'm sure many of our listeners tonight have heard the research that is about, when you're sitting in a room and a woman says something, often it gets swallowed up into the void, and as soon as a man says the same thing, great idea, what a great concept. We actually, because that voice is not the voice that we are used to hearing in terms of being the leader, because they're non-dominant, because they're in the minority, we need to change the view of what leadership actually looks like. And a leader, a female leader, is not one that we see a lot around, particularly in our workplace. So when you're in a meeting and there's another woman, you need to amplify her voice. You need to give her the opportunity to speak up, and you need to find others do that for you, men and women, to actually champion you, because we can't do this alone. It is hard work, and we need to get sponsors, we need to have some mentoring, and we really need to look at the opportunity. What does the landscape, what does the environment need for us to be a leader in this space?
Terry, you've talked a lot about the needs for making sure there's some allowance for numbers of women being given roles. Can you explain that a little bit further? Because I know in politics it's a very simple area where the right wing of politics sort of say, no, we don't need quotas, and quotas is a very politicised word. Can you give us a sense of how we need to do it for the betterment of everybody?
Suzi's right. It's about voice, and you really don't have equal voice until you're above probably 30 or 40% in a room. While you don't have that kind of a proportion, then there's all of these other things come into play that help drown you out. So I think as a society going forward, and I mean, I'd love to think that this is going to create a burning platform for change. I really do. But going forward, we need to start pressing for, particularly in our representative leaders, so those that we elect, they are there to represent the population. So we have 51% women in this country. So it's not really a representative democracy unless you've got 51% of our parliamentarians being women and our cabinet members being women. So it's a bit of a furphy to say it's representative when it's not. In the corporate sector, there's a huge aversion to quotas. But interestingly enough, Australia and the UK are the only two countries in the world where we've managed to get 30% plus representation on our biggest boards without quotas. So it is possible when there's a will, and you get certainly influencers, you get some legislative stuff happening, the stock exchange. When people want this to happen, it actually happens. So when you've got leaders that understand the importance of diversity and the benefits that it generates, so it's obviously an issue of social justice, but it's also an issue of just getting things right and making the best decisions. So those that are enlightened in the private sector can actually see the value in diversity. They don't need to be driven to it with quotas. They're blazing a pathway to increase profitability.
And this is a really great quote from a woman who's really led this way for the last 10 years or so. Her name's Liz Broderick. And she says, unless we intentionally put gender at the centre of our actions, we will be sleepwalking into the future where existing inequalities are either replicated or exacerbated. We often sort of focus just in on how much more money men get paid per year versus a woman in a similar role. But Suzi, you also talk about this amazing thing about the canary in the birdcage. Can you just give us a sense of that? Because I think since maybe the late 90s, 2000s, we've really been talking about diversity and older workers and workers from different migrant backgrounds. We embrace that. But the key one, as Terry's talked about, 51% of the population in Australia is women, and we're just not getting that down to the grassroots area, especially in this trade environment.
Yeah, and I think what is important is we actually take out some of the conversation that it is a problem for women to fix. And I know that we're not saying that, but it does come across a lot that this is a women's issue. And it's not. As Terry said, 51% of the communities, we're not being represented at the levels to make decisions. So I think, the canary in the coal mine really does identify that we are not hearing from all voices. And gender is one aspect, but we do know that when we can start getting more of an equal representation of men and women, that we're going to start seeing other elements of diversity as well. But being that lone voice, so we need to get men. We need to have understanding that our champions, our male champions and female champions, all need to work together to create this change. And to be honest, we need to look at what the risks are, because for many men, this can be very threatening, particularly when they looked at their career path and the journey, that there was an assurance, I've done my time, I will step up, I've earned it, there's some entitlement. And we need to shift that thinking as well. And I think, Terry's brought up, we've talked about quotas and targets. We actually have to make this measurable. We really need to ensure that we get the 30% of women so that we can start creating change, because under that, it is overwhelming. I work with so many women where they'll say, I'm the only female in a meeting, and it is exhausting. And do I have to act like everybody else around the table? Absolutely not. They need to find their own voice, but that can be challenging.
Suzi, you talked about, in a room, how we amplify that in a meeting. Let's say on a building site, we've actually got a question that we might roll this question if we could, Andrew. This is a really powerful question that came from a young electrician. Let's hear from her.
My question is in regards to discrimination. So often my colleagues sort of bear witness to me being discriminated against, and although they're very protective of me and will often say something about it afterwards, they can never find the words to say at the time, and nor can I sometimes. Sometimes I'll call it out, but there's often times, particularly when people are in a high position, that I just sort of feel, as much as it disappoints me, I laugh it off sometimes, or just do an eye twinge. So my question is, what are some techniques that I can use and my fellow colleagues can use in order to highlight and call out discrimination when we see it at the time in a sort of useful way, and not a detrimental way, sort of thing. Yeah, thanks.
Such an honest question, and obviously this is happening to this young woman all the time. Now, Terry, in your research, you use qualitative research, which is all about listening to people like this young woman, and that which gives you information, as you describe, much richer data than just stats. Maybe we could start with you, Terry. You know, there's a lot of things happening in that question. You know, obviously she's probably one of the very few women on her building site. She doesn't get the support she needs, maybe because some of the other people don't know how to do it. We've talked around it, but can you just talk back to what we've just heard from that young woman?
It's difficult in being in that situation. So it's not easy just to say what I'm going to say, but it from all of the feedback I've received over the years and in hundreds of interviews, you've got to call it when you see it. And don't laugh it off because it trivializes it. It is serious. People who are doing it to you need to understand it's serious. And it was good to hear that the people around her are supportive after the fact. But that's an open conversation that needs to happen with her colleagues that are supportive, that she can go to them and say, when you see this happen to me, I'd like your support in calling it out. Now, if she was in an environment with everyone doing it, that would be different, but she said that she's got that support. So that the feedback that I've received over and over again is respectfully call it out. You know, don't make a massive issue of it, but call it when you hear it and actually say, did you just say that? And when you say that, this is what it's doing to me. And those kinds of strategies work. You know, that if you're calling it out and your colleagues support you, it doesn't happen again. Or if it happens again, at least you've got people behind you to take it further.
And Terry, I know I can't remember the name of the person, but you know, she talks a lot about bullying in workplaces, and one of the other strategies that they often talk about is actually if you can't do it directly to the person because it is too confronting, or you fear in some way that you may get violence or more bullying back, get someone else, so create the triangle effect so that someone else can actually go there on your behalf. And that goes back to strong leadership on a local level. Very weird example, but a mate of mine, an NBL basketball player, his sister was gay, and these people making these trivial conversations about gay women. And this is a long time ago, 94, 96. And in the middle of it, he just stopped everybody and said, stop this. My sister is gay. Just stop this. You know, and no one would have thought this quite handsome basketball player would have actually been at all caring about this. But he was a fantastic advocate, and he stopped everybody dead in their tracks. And then that conversation went away. Suzi, we saw that woman talking. Terry's given some really good advice. What do you see? Because again, to me, it's about how do people on that work site, who her employees are, because it's against the law what's happening with her anyway, isn't it?
I think, look, it's firstly, it takes a lot of courage to hear from somebody like that, and it's risky as well. And yes, it is against the law, and if you're going to take it down to that laneway, and whether you get some HR support and advice. But I think what's really important is that we need to understand that a lot of this is not even conscious. Some people are doing it unconsciously, and when we question them, they'll say, oh, but I was just joking, or I didn't mean it seriously. And, you know, we used to do a lot of work with Dr. Robert Wood, and from the Melbourne, he was at University of Melbourne, and he had the no just joking rule that he would take to workplaces. And I think that is really clever, because often they're said in jest, but they come from somewhere. And one of the questions that I like to encourage people to ask is actually about, and Terry was talking about this as well, but for others to actually say, help me understand what you mean by that. Help me understand, because what you're saying is either whether it's hurtful or insulting, or it makes me feel uncomfortable, if you have the courage to say the other part. But if you don't have that, even just by asking them to help you to understand what the comment is referring to, then what it does, it actually stops people in their tracks to start thinking about, okay, And then some of the questions could be, if your daughter was in the room, would you be comfortable for that comment? If I was your daughter, would you be saying that to me? And it really depends. You know, we have to make sure that we're setting people up for safety as well. And sometimes it is safer to walk away, unfortunately. But as you were saying, we need to find the advocates to support us as well, because we don't want the guilt. I have a lot of women that will come to us and say, I felt terrible. I just didn't have the confidence or the courage to speak up. But I knew if I did, I'd be targeted more. So we need to ensure that these steps are safe as well. And, you know, the humour part, sometimes people say, I just make a joke of it. But as Terry said, it becomes more of a joke. And then we're giving it permission to keep going. So we need to be careful of what we're subscribing. It can be very lonely when you're the only one speaking up. So it's finding the support from behind the scenes as well.
And Fiona, you also have a sense around that too, don't you? You know, what was your personal experience when you were in trade land, let's say?
Oh, yes, I find that question very relatable, and I can see in the chat there's a few fellow tradies that also find it quite relatable. And I mean, it's just something you cop almost every day in trade, and you kind of cop it so much that you just let it happen, which we really shouldn't. We should really call it out and say something. And I think to do that is so brave, and for that question to come through as well really inspires others to stand up. You know, you might stand up and say, oh, I'm calling this out because it makes me feel uncomfortable. And the person next to you will say, well, it makes me feel uncomfortable as well. So it's one person's voice and one person's courage that can often inspire others to step up and take a similar action. And again, it all comes back to that voice and the culture and leaders and us all taking a step within ourselves and our own leadership journeys to step up and say something. And, you know, my own leadership journey with Tradeswomen Australia has been very much about that, stepping up and saying something for women in trades who don't have the voice to do it themselves, or perhaps are a little bit afraid to do it for themselves. So, you know, that's been a huge part of our journey. And in fact, my leadership journey, and I'd like to circle this into a question, if I may, Andrew Gill.
Of course you may. Yeah, Mcdonald.
Thank you. My leadership journey has been rather inspiring for me. Without any formal training, I found it really resourceful to lean on a lot of mentors and a lot of other executives, men and women who are really willing to give up me support. And you see that on our board and on our councils as well, and fantastic colleagues and networks like yourselves, Suzi and Terry. But for me to have mentors has really helped and inspired me. Do you have any advice on anyone out there who may be seeking a mentor on how they can approach someone for that mentorship?
Absolutely. I think the best lesson I ever got was from my PhD supervisor. And there's a world leader in gender equality, Alice Eagley, and she's kind of like the superstar of academia, if there's such a thing. And I could see arguments going on in the literature, and I was disagreeing, and I kept going back to my supervisor and saying, oh, look, I don't agree with this. And he was saying, well, why don't you email her? And this went on for about 6 months. And in the end, he said, look, I'm not going to talk to you about this anymore. Here's her email address. Talk to her about it. And I'm thinking, well, who am I? Why? You know, I'm a guy, first of all. I'm on the other side of the planet. Why would she even respond to me? And I thought, okay, well, I'll give it a go. And what I did was I thought, okay, what exactly do I want from a contact with her? And I thought, okay, I would like her explanation of what's going on, and this is my view of it. So I spent days putting an email together and sent this 11-page email, which is ridiculous, but it was an 11-page email. And she responded the next morning with a 6-page email telling me why I was wrong. And I went, okay, well, hang on, no, that's not right. So we backward and forwarded for about a week. At the end of it, we ended up right in the middle. We agreed pretty much on everything else. And she said, look, next time you're in Chicago, come and see me. And I said to my wife, we've got to go. You know, he's the leading authority in the world. So I guess the moral of the story is, first of all, if you don't ask, you'll never know. And the second part of it is, what's the worst thing that can happen? They're just going to ignore you or say no, and you've lost nothing. So my advice is, have a really structured approach. Understand why you want that person as a mentor, and just say that, you know, when you make the contact, I'm approaching you because, And I think that's the best advice I could give.
And Terry, you a Spinal Tap fan?
No.
Because in Spinal Tap, there's a classic scene where they turn the amplifier up to 11. So I thought you might have sent 11 pages just for that. Suzi, what's your advice about seeking out mentors? Because sometimes we don't know what a mentor is. I think nowadays it's again, the language is strong. We understand. What should we be doing?
Well, I even think knowing that the language is strong, it's something we can talk about, but a mentor can take different forms at different times as well. I like this concept of having your own board of directors. Jim Collins actually created that. And I think it's actually looking at the people around you. Are they the ones that can take you to where you want to go? Do they sound too much like you? Do they know you from what you used to be? Are they keeping you small? Are they enabling you to take the steps forward? And it's actually looking around that table to see who are the ones that can take, that can challenge me, that can enable me to step up. Who are the ones that can see in me what maybe I can't see in myself? And sometimes I encourage people not to call it a mentor, because that can be a really awkward conversation. It's like, Sheryl Sandberg jokes about, will you be my mother? Will you be my mentor? It's sort of like it's awkward and people don't know what that means. It is about having the open conversation that at this stage in my career, this is what I'm looking for. And as like Terry said, to be really clear and identify what's needed, and also to ensure that they're not too much like you as well, that they can actually give you that growth edge, which is so important. And men and women, I think, for, and people who work in very different ways to us, who see the world differently, they're the ones that can challenge our views more so.
Great advice. Fiona, how does that sit with you? Because maybe you could also give us your insight into what you've done with mentors, because you've certainly done what Suzi was talking about there. You've surrounded yourself with experts from different fields who might have a focus and a passion on, let's say, empowering women in this particular area. But what's your experience, and what would your advice be?
Yeah, well, I have a very clear message, and I obviously am very supportive of women in trades, and I think that sometimes it's good to bounce that off people with a different opinion and to hear feedback and advice from different people who've walked in different shoes. So I know my background has been trade, but to hear an opinion from someone who's worked in executive leadership, who's worked in a totally different industry, be it surgical or sports or something else, just to bounce back with them on what they've experienced and the barriers that they've had. There's so many learnings to be had just from listening to someone, and I really enjoy listening to those around me and talking to them, bouncing things off them, and receiving constructive criticism as well. I mean, I'm not afraid to be told that I'm doing something wrong or I should be doing it a different way, and I'm willing to listen to that and absorb it, because it's all really important information to look at things in many different ways to make sure that you choose the most correct way that's for you, and obviously in my shoes right now for our organisation as well. So yeah, I think it's really valuable to surround yourself with many different personalities and opinions as you can, and make sure you listen to them as well, because people who provide you that time and give you that support want to make sure that it's being heard. So, whether or not you choose to follow it is up to you at the end of the day, but to make sure that you're thankful and that you've received it well is really important.
Such a great definition of leadership, Fiona. You're exemplifying it. Having the courage, having the insight, and also the commitment to grow and learn.
And isn't it important, Suzi and Terry, that actually if someone comes to you, often people looking for, the old expression, a hand out as opposed to a hand up. And so I'm sure in your careers, all three of you often have had people who are really just trying to, get to the next step without doing any hard work themselves, or just trying to just get there by themselves without any real effort. It's recognising the passion and that care to a cause or a need to make that happen.
And I think it is about speaking, we talked earlier about values as well and what's important to you. And I think the more that you can share why, what's driving you, what concerns you, where the gaps are, then you're actually, people are encouraged to step in. And one thing that we haven't said, which is so important, that innately we love to help people. And so often people will say, oh, I'm a bit scared to ask, they're so busy, and what will they think of me, like Terry's example. But often it's the biggest gift that we can give someone, and it's a compliment as well. So, and they'll tell us if they haven't got the time or they're not able to step in at the moment. But I think it's really important to be able to do that, is paying it forward.
Exactly, paying forward, and it does. Yeah, sometimes you don't see it directly back, do you, Suzi? But it does come. You give it to someone else, and someone gives you something in return, and it's just amazing.
Yeah.
What about just this little sense of I don't want to sort of finish on a negative area, but we've also negativity. That's a special word I've just invented. By the way. I'm looking for a new dictionary sponsor, negatively. But let's just talk a bit about, in this area, what's the opportunity? And it might be slipping away a bit because things are becoming more relaxed, but we've talked a lot about the blue sky dreaming about what this COVID-19 enabled us to think about and do. Maybe Suzi and Terry, how can we give women, especially young women, old women, because again, a lot of these women are also paid less money, they're in not permanent positions across the board. What can we do in terms of getting them more focused or respected and supported in this time? How can we help in that area?
One of the things I'd like to see going forward, and we were talking about this last week, is the idea that I think we won't go back to the old way of working. I'm hearing it everywhere around the world, is the idea of flexibility. It was one of the biggest hurdles, I think, and also one of the greatest enablers of women in the workplace. Was true flexibility. That is true discretion over how, when, and where you do your work. And the vast majority of organisations thought that was impossible. We can't go back. The ships have been burnt in the new world. There is no going back. So I think women are advantaged who have worked flexibly. This isn't a new world for many women. This is the world that they're in. So I'd like to see organisations, and I think we will see organisations embrace flexibility, and that, I think, will certainly drive gender equality forward. There'll still be other things that we have to tackle, but I think the flexibility nut hopefully has been cracked.
Yeah, and I think also we're starting to see a different way of working. So it is okay to have dad at home with a baby on his lap, and it's okay to have mum at home with the dog walking past. And we're starting to understand who people are. And I think that for women is really important. We need to be role modelling that it's not just women working from home. We need to see, all of us, of who we are as a workforce, and also the challenges. I'm hearing from a lot from men they're understanding first time what the juggle's really like. So your question, Andrew, about what we can do to support women is actually acknowledge the challenges that, as Terry said, we know flexibility can work. We know that remote working can work. It's with this reopen phase, we have to start identifying what we want to keep, and to really hold on to that and be firm so that we don't let those gems also slip back, because the slippage is really crucial. It's, they say don't ever waste a good crisis. We need to ensure that we've got some huge wins, particularly for women.
Yeah.
You agree with that too, Terry?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've been having these conversations over the last fortnight in so many different forums. And I think probably the most important thing is to provide voice to that. Free childcare. Who'd have thought? We need to fight to keep that. We have to fight to keep that, along with flexibility. These are great ideas that become necessary, and they are the way forward. But we just need to make sure we don't slip back.
Well,
and how quickly, quickly it's happened as well, which is amazing. I was working with some women from transport, and they were saying that there was an 18-month process in the department to actually create flexibility focus, and it happened in a week. So the fact that we are made changes so quickly, we need to really ensure that we're learning from those quick decisions, agile working, and also being so adaptive.
And thank goodness you didn't use the word pivoting. But it is important, isn't it? You know, that we can get rid of lots of meetings, lots of planning meetings, and just get on and do it. So we want focus on words when it comes to the language we use in front of people and how we describe people. But we want action when we're making these changes, and we need to hold on to those fast changes. We've had an amazing time, everyone. Thank you so much for a great evening. Fiona, thank you. Are you going well today now?
Always, Andrew, of course. I think it was a fabulous session, and I just want to say thank you so much to Suzi and Terry for giving us your time and sharing some of your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it. The comments in the chat have been very appreciative, and from all of us, a huge thank you for your support.
Thank you. And congratulations, Fiona. Well done you. This is great. Really great initiative, and it's great to see you stepping up and not just being lucky that you are given that award, that you'd obviously deserved it as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
And also, everybody, thank you to Jane Sidman-Clark, our chair of Trades Women Australia, who's been looking after. She's actually putting it. I can see her waving there. She's waving there. She's got the best background going around. I need to find out where she gets her backgrounds. She's had them commissioned probably. But also, everybody, if leadership is important to you, please share this with your colleagues and friends and register for our next episode. So this link will come to you because you've been part of our broadcast. As you know, conditions may have changed, and they did just today in Victoria from when we first recorded this. But on behalf of Trades Women Australia, please stay well. Thank you again to Terry and Suzi. Have a great evening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.